of all, we should probably define for you what the EBP gap is, because I think that's probably a term that might be something that we made up, but nevertheless, it exists. So let me help with that a little bit. Those of us that are and have been in the community corrections industry for some time remember way back when we were really good at supervision because of the number of people that we arrested and put back in custody when they broke the rules. And it doesn't matter whether you're a parole agent or a probation officer or you're working in the institutions and you catch people doing the things they're not supposed to be doing, you knew you were doing a good job because you caught them and you were able to punish them further. So along comes this evidence-based practices in my career about 15 years ago, and it started telling me that the things that I was doing that I thought I was very good at were the wrong things, that I shouldn't be focusing on arresting people and detaining people and catching them doing things wrong, that I should actually be looking at those things that people do right and focusing on building their strengths and focusing on providing them opportunity. And that if I did that, that the things that they were doing wrong would sort of take care of themselves. Now, of course, there's a public safety component to everything that all of us do, and we have to focus on that public safety component, but it turns out that there was this whole other way of promoting public safety that didn't involve handcuffs and a sidearm. So evidence-based practices is something that as a probation officer, as a supervisor, as a manager, and as an administrator, I have been trying to promote for the better part of the last decade. And there has been this ongoing tension within my industry and with me as an executive where I am trying to get to an evidence-based reality, but the reality is that it is also just a journey. I'm never actually going to get to be an evidence-based shop, but I am always going to continually strive to produce an evidence-based environment from my staff. That means that all these things you see up here on the screen from like IBIS and STIX and EPICS and CBT programming and assessments for risk and assessments for need, all of this stuff that we have to implement in our environments. And I don't care if you work in an institutional environment or you work in a community corrections setting, all of these things are things that we're being asked to implement in our environments. And the gap is the reality between where I am as an agency and where I continue to be as an agency and where I want to be as an agency. And quite frankly, as an administrator, it is sometimes hard for me to tell whether or not these things that I am trying to do are actually being done. So if adopting an evidence-based approach is our goal, let's call it our vision, is adopting an evidence-based approach, there are a variety of role players in getting to an evidence-based approach. So starting with me, the administrator in my agency, what is it that my role is as an administrator? It's really, if you think about it, pretty simple, right? Like I'm supposed to put the pieces in place so that the people below me can make sure that these evidence-based practices wind up being delivered to our customer, to our client, to the people that we are serving in our agency. That in and of itself is a major transition, right? Like, think about working on the floor in a prison or a juvenile hall or a local jail, or supervising a defendant population in the community who have done things sometimes horribly wrong to others, and envisioning them as a client, as somebody we're providing a service to. That mind shift is a major ask of somebody who is a lifelong criminal justice practitioner. And whether or not they carry this mindset shift with them into the field to an individual officer as an administrator, I don't know. As a program manager, all of my direct reports, their responsibility is to take my vision and to take those things that I've contracted for, those services, those implementations, and to carry them out into their division. So in the probation world, I'm responsible for both adult and juvenile in California, and I'm responsible for both the community side of things and the custodial side of things when it comes to kids. And I have managers that run all those programs, and their responsibility, of course, is to take my vision and to take those things that I've paid for and to implement them across the span of their control. So they may have multiple units. They may have geographically remote units. They may have units that are responsible for care that is in-house as well as in the community. They may have units that are responsible for different types of populations, but they're to ensure that all of those things that I want done as the chief administrator end up getting done. And then you've got your unit supervisors, your folks that are running particular types of activities. So they may be running field operations, or they may be running institutional operations. Or if you're in a prison or you're in a jail, they may be running re-entry operations, or they may be running lifer operations, or they may be running, you name it, in your environment. But those unit supervisors are the ones that really are where the rubber meets the road. I tell my staff all the time, unit supervisors are the most valuable level of our organization. I can disappear for a month, and the organization's pretty much going to be okay. My managers can disappear for probably 3 weeks, and everything's going to continue to be about the same as it was 3 weeks before they left. If a unit supervisor disappears for a few minutes and there isn't somebody there to take up the slack while they're gone, that's a problem in an organization. So your supervisorial level staff are really critical. And when you're asking for things to be implemented that are new and cutting edge and sometimes run counterculture to your environment, your supervisors are the ones that are constantly driving the message home with the staff to ensure that these things are taking place. And then of course you've got your client-facing staff, your client case managers. This is anywhere from your prison guards to your detention staff in the juvenile hall, to your probation officers, your parole agents, anybody that actually has a client impact. It could also be your treatment providers. Some of them are your paraprofessional staff, some of them are your clinical staff. But they all have a client-facing role. And their responsibility in this evidence-based world is to ensure that the application of those specific interventions is actually happening with our client population, with the people we are serving directly. So the question is, do those client-facing staff actually know when they're engaged in an evidence-based practice? And I would submit to you that the response is maybe. They might be extremely well trained and extremely well educated and understand at a very ground level what an evidence-based approach looks like in every circumstance. If that person exists in your organization, figure out how to clone them and duplicate them throughout the organization, because it's a really special breed of practitioner. That's the unicorn that's in your midst. Most practitioners, I would say, have a pretty good idea whether or not they're engaged in an evidence-based practice, but they don't really know whether or not they are consistently engaged in an evidence-based practice. For the supervisors, and again, I say that these are the most important people in our organization as far as making sure that stuff's getting done. For the supervisors, do they know when their unit as a whole is engaged in an evidence-based approach? Do they know that, say, they've got 12 direct reports, or maybe they might have as few as 6, they probably have more like 10 direct reports. But up to 12 or 15 sometimes for some jurisdictions in the way that they structure their supervision. And can you possibly know what your staff are doing all day, every day? Well, clearly the answer is no. You can't keep track of what an individual is doing, especially when they go behind a closed door with a client and they're doing a one-on-one with a client. Can the supervisor really know whether or not the client-facing staff is engaged in an evidence-based approach, or whether they've done really well in training and they say that they're doing all of this great interactive work and relationship building with the client. But the reality is when they go in behind that closed door into that office, they just sort of push all that away and continue on that traditional route of we're going to do a drug test, we're going to find out if you had any police contacts, we're going to find out if you got a job, whether you're paying your restitution, have you moved, and then that's the end of the communication. And then the case notes don't exactly reflect what actually took place in the room. And what about our managers? You've got managers that have multiple areas of responsibility and multiple direct reports that are a layer between them and the client-facing staff, which are 2 layers away removed from the client themselves. Can the managers know whether or not they are implementing that vision, that philosophy that I've set as an executive and asked them to be responsible for? Do they know whether or not their divisions are making a difference in the community or making a difference in the custodial environment? Do they know whether they are making things better, not having an effect at all, or making things worse? Most managers will tell you, yeah, I think we're doing great work. Well, can you prove it to me? Can you show me the type of work that you're doing, and can you show me that the type of work that you're doing is making a difference? And the reality is, for the most part, with the tools we have today, the answer is no. They can tell me what they're doing. They can show me the inputs, but they can't show me the effect that they're having, or whether or not the inputs that they are engaged in are actually quality inputs. So where does that leave me? As an administrator, I have no idea whether or not the time, treasure, and talent from the taxpayers that I am committing to this evidence-based approach, and trust me, it's expensive to engage in these evidence-based practices, tons of training, tons of time, tons of opportunity cost where the money could be invested in other ways. Do I, as an administrator, have the ability to tell policymakers and people responsible for budgets that what we're doing is a good investment of time, treasure, and talent? The reality is, I can tell them that we are doing X, and we are doing X well, but I can't really tell them the type of impact that we're having in the community. Can I measure recidivism? Yes. I can tell them whether our recidivism is up, down, or static. Can I tell them why? Not really. So I mentioned in the beginning that EBP, or community corrections, has been heavily impacted by EBP, and that when I started in corrections, making 100 arrests a year meant I was a good probation officer. I was functioning well. That's how I was measured against my colleagues. And so they measured how many drug tests I took. They measured how many office visits I did. They measured how many searches, how many arrests, how many warrants issued. They measured those things, and they said, you're a good PO because you check all these boxes. Client need wasn't different then than it is now. Client need is exactly the same. We're talking about human beings that needed certain things 22 years ago when I started. But the difference is we have gotten so much better at addressing the way we work with clients and their needs. So whereas it used to be I would try and influence clients and their behavior through really, to be quite frank, force and fear. Fear of going to jail, fear of being sent to prison, and force in that I would tell them, the court said X, you do X, everything's fine. Court said X, you do Y, everything's not fine, and then I step in and take my official action. Well, we have gotten so much better in our interactions with people, and it doesn't matter, custodial environment, non-custodial environment. We are simply having better conversations, and we are focusing on more meaningful things that make a difference, that make our probation officers, parole agents, and corrections officers true change agents. Like not just supervision agents, but true change agents, where they are working in an environment where they are focused on behavior change, almost at a clinical level in many ways, without clinical training. And as a result, we're actually changing behavior. I'll give you a great example. So evidence-based approaches in California have been in place at a juvenile level for the better part of 15 years or so. And financially, we have been investing heavily in juvenile corrections for the last 12 years. 12 years ago, there were 12,000 kids at the Division of Juvenile Justice under the responsibility of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Today, there are between 560 and 600. That is stark and startling, 12,000 to 560 to 575 over a very short, not even a generation, over a very short period of time. And that wasn't a policy change that said you can't send kids here. That wasn't a policy change that said you can't send this type of kid here. I can still send any type of kid I want. But the reality is that we changed our practices and we simply don't have as many kids in the system today. I closed down a juvenile hall, one of two in my county, a week ago because I don't need 80 beds any longer. I need 20. And so we're seeing this trend all across the country where this evidence-based approach has resulted now, a decade later, in more positive outcomes by reduced recidivism and reduced people in custody. But implementing EBP is hard. I told you it's expensive. It takes a lot of time. I have been in El Dorado County, I think it was mentioned in my bio, for a little over 5.5 years now. 22 years in corrections, 10 years as an executive, 5.5 years in El Dorado County. And when I got to El Dorado County, they were kind of low on the evidence-based practices implementation pathway. And we have moved mountains in the last 5.5 years as to the evidence-based approaches that we have begun deploying in my organization. But it has taken every bit of that 5.5 years to get a relatively small organization there. So my organization is about 135 people, so I can pretty much know everybody in the organization. I can pretty much touch everybody in the organization, not literally, just figuratively, because I don't want to go to prison or lose my job. But the point being that management of implementations is much easier in smaller environments. You look at a New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, any of the bigger environments where you're trying to deploy an evidence-based approach, and you can imagine how difficult it is for an administrator at my rank to actually have a hands-on effect of the implementation of any sort of change within a government agency, more or less in a corrections agency, where we're really good at tradition. We're really good at doing the same thing tomorrow that we did today and we figured out how to do yesterday. What we're not good at, ironically, working in a behavior change field, is changing ourselves. We're very incalcitrant, if you will. We are very difficult, and we come to change very slowly, which means it's expensive because we have to repeatedly do the same thing over and over and over again in order to get corrections officers to change their own behavior to help improve the behavior change in their clients. So we use tools. We use things like risk needs assessments in an automated platform. We use case management systems that are automated to maintain all of our records. We use electronic monitoring for GPS and EM or for alcohol monitoring. Software attached to that. We have all of these various platforms, electronic drug testing, integrations between these various systems. But at the end of the day, all of these systems are very linear. And what do I mean by linear? I mean that they're very good at having a beginning point where a case begins and then making recommendations for the next activity based on the prior activity. So if this, then X. But it can really only consider one of a couple things, maybe two things if it's super complicated, if it's a super complicated and sophisticated system. But it usually pays attention to what was the event that just happened and what's the date on the calendar. And it'll recommend to you the next activity based on the next date on the calendar and that prior event. Those are our case management systems, those are our drug testing systems, those are our reminder systems. Plus, we've got data all over the place. We've got data in each of those disparate systems. We've got data at the courts, we've got data at the DA's office, we've got data at the police agencies, we've got data in my juvenile hall versus data that's in the field with my probation officers, and very, very often that data does not get coalesced into a single point. And so when you're a decision maker at a case level, it's very difficult to consolidate all of that data yourself as a human being. And frankly, even if you could take all those disparate data sources and collect all the relevant data and squelch all of the noise, you don't necessarily, as a corrections practitioner, have the ability to make the types of decisions that need to be made to focus on the client's needs at the moment. And here's what I mean. Every individual that you're working with is an individual. So what works for client X will not necessarily work for client Y, even though the circumstances are very similar on the external factors, because there's a bunch of internal factors that they have. And you have to consider and take into account all of those internal factors as well. So now you're being asked as a single human being to look at all of the internal factors of your client, look at all of the external factors of all the things that they're engaged in and all the things that they're not engaged in, and come up with a decision that makes sense at that moment with them. Because remember, time plays a factor as well. What makes sense to make a decision with that client today may not be the right decision tomorrow because certain circumstances with them have changed. And you have to synthesize all of that down to make the right decision to promote the best behavior change. And I don't care if you're in custody or out of custody, it's impossible to know everything. Even if you did know everything, it's impossible to synthesize everything. And even if you could do that, even if you could know everything, and even if you could synthesize everything, nobody has the time to be able to do it. It's super time intensive, it's super labor intensive, and I've got a caseload of, today we even have smaller caseloads, but I've got a caseload of anywhere from 35 to 65, or if I'm working with really low risk clients, maybe 100 or 200 in a bank caseload, and I'm supposed to make educated decisions as to what's in their best interest to promote the highest level of public safety so that I reduce victimization in the community. And the reality is, I don't have time to do all of that. And I definitely don't have all of the necessary training and experience because I'm a non-clinician, and I probably can't synthesize all the data anyway. And this is what we're talking about when we reference the black box of community supervision. So as an executive who has appointed managers and asked them to run supervisors who are running units that are working with clients, what goes on behind that closed door, in that office, or in that interview room, or at that jail cell, or wherever the interaction is taking place in the person's house or at their place of employment. The question is, what is the quality of the interaction between that case manager and that client in that moment? And the black box of community supervision, which is a well-studied phenomenon, and what takes place in that time period makes a major, major difference as to whether or not a client gets better and recidivism is reduced and victimization is reduced, or a client stays the same or even gets worse because of the lack of quality in the interaction between the client and the case manager, because the case manager isn't employing the best of evidence-based practices or isn't employing the best of relationship development with that person. And so what takes place in that black box of community supervision is something that we really need to understand as administrators, managers, supervisors, and practitioners who really want to get it right. We really want to know, are we doing the best we can? Are we employing the practices in this moment, in this circumstance, with this client that makes the most sense right now? I pose a few questions to you. Really, as a practitioner working with clients, wouldn't it be nice if I could see, as an administrator, whether we are moving in a positive direction, whether or not my agency is doing what I say it does. So I make all kinds of great statements in the media, and I tell the policymakers and the budget folks, yes, we're doing the right thing. Yes, we're making a difference. Yes, people are getting better as a result. And I can show them anecdote after anecdote after anecdote. But can I really tell them that tomorrow at 3 o'clock between probation officer X and client Y, that the interaction between those two is going to be an evidence-based interaction, and that the outcome of that evidence-based interaction is going to be overall a positive movement towards the reduction of recidivism? No, I can't. And really, wouldn't it be nice if, as a manager, you knew which of your units were doing well and which of your units were not doing so well, where you could focus your resources and your attention on those units that really needed your support, and those units that are doing really well. As a manager, you could say, you guys are doing a great job. I want to replicate and duplicate what you're doing. I want to figure out what you're doing right. I want to figure out how you're doing it right. And then I want to move that into those units that aren't doing so well. Or as a supervisor, wouldn't it be great to know, hey, as a unit, we're doing real solid work. But I've got this little rough spot here where this person, as opposed to the rest of the unit, of similar type cases and situations, this one person needs my attention, this one person needs my help because their skill level doesn't seem to be quite what the other skill levels happen to be. Or as a case manager, a true, honest-to-goodness, Kool-Aid drinking, love evidence-based practice, love what I do for a living, really want to make a difference in my community. Wouldn't it be nice to know that you are using the best of what science has to offer at this point, and you are employing it effectively, and you are employing it consistently with your client base? And right now, you can tend to feel it as a client-facing person, but you don't really know it as a client-facing person. So I'm going to turn this over to West Huddleston to talk to you about a solution. Okay.
So, Brian, thank you for that masterful description of how, first of all, what is evidence-based practices in community corrections, and then just all of the obstacles that officers, supervisors, and administrators face in either deploying evidence-based practices or, heck, knowing whether evidence-based practices are actually being deployed. So it has occurred to me over many years of working in this industry as well as a practitioner, a probation officer. I was a correctional case manager working behind the bars in the Department of Corrections in Tennessee, and then later in alternative sentencing, as you heard in my bio. It oftentimes perplexed me that evidence-based practices could not be automated. That technology just wasn't capable of doing that, and yet I'm a guy who thinks that my iPhone makes me a better version of myself. And so about 5 years ago, I realized that predictive analytics were being used in professional hockey and professional soccer to give those teams an advantage, a winning advantage, and that this AI and predictive analytics is used all the time in sports. And initially we heard about it in Moneyball. And that AI decision support engines make healthcare more evidence-based and streamlined. Well, I would say that those types of emerging technologies can today be brought to bear to improve efficacy, quality assurance, and ultimately improve client outcomes in community corrections. It's just never been attempted before. So I want to, at least until now, let me say that. So I think broadly, I'd like to talk about the attributes of an evidence-based enabled software solution. What would that look like? What would the attributes be? How would that be pulled off? And I would suggest that there are kind of 4 quadrants of an evidence-based driven software solution for community corrections. Number 1, it has to automate client-level data. Officers spend, on average, if you look at time studies, 60% of their time hunting down client-level information, whether it's an attendance at a AA or a clinical session or a drug test result. They spend 60% of their time tracking that down from all those disparate systems that Brian talked about and entering it manually into the case system. So that is an immense amount of time that takes them away from what they are trained to do and what they want to do with their time and their life, which is to be about changing behavior, as Brian said. So number 1, I think an EBP solution, software solution, must automate data into one source of truth, if you will. Secondly, it should actively guide individualized case planning and supervision planning. We'll talk about this in a minute. Number 3 is it should surface any actionable insight to the officer about their client and recommend a response steeped in behavioral science. All of that exists. A system needs to be able to synthesize that and to actively perform it on behalf of the officer. And then number 4 is if all that data is being collected, synthesized, surfaced, recommended, and responded to, then you have an incredibly rich opportunity to drive analytics and continuous improvement at all sorts of levels. So that's how an evidence-based software solution should act and should behave. And today, most systems out there that are, case management systems they're static. They don't think, they don't recommend, they don't automate. I think we can get there with modern technology. So starting with automating client-level data into one source, referrals to treatment providers. This is a fundamental opportunity for software to solve the EBP gap in community corrections. Software can refer a client, automate a client referral to an outside provider. That's not difficult to do. Number two is, I think, even more important, provide the service provider the opportunity to push automated data, binary data, back to the system through a secure, encrypted process, so that the officer doesn't have to spend time on the phone or spend time looking at sign-in sheets, for example, that we've seen recently, or a monthly report to see if their client was actually receiving the services that they were supposed to receive. Drug test data, we see integrations with drug testing labs, but what about the immunoassay cups? What about the immunoassay test that occurs by the provider? How do we get that data automated into one sole source? Simply a portal would do it from that pushes to a system as I'm describing. Electronic monitoring data, easily integrated into case management, and then field visit data, putting apps in the hands of officers where they know if a vicious dog is present, or they have information about co-defendants, or they are aware of certain requirements of the client and whether the client has performed those requirements going into that field visit or that office, or excuse me, that home visit. Modern technology can solve that. And then finally, appointment reminders to the client. So an evidence-based software solution, one that's dynamic in nature, would know where the client is supposed to be when through the supervision plan. And as such, it would be able to listen for whether that client was going or not. But more importantly, I think it would recommend to the client where they should be and how often. Those appointment reminders are kind of take it to the bank, a way to improve retention and reduce recidivism, just have better client outcomes. I get hounded by my doctors. I received a text yesterday from a dermatologist who I have not seen in a year, but it's just that time of the year to schedule an appointment, and I received a text message reminding me to reach out to my dermatologist. I'm okay, by the way, don't worry about it. But appointment reminders on that phone, it is a great way to improve client retention. Now, evidence-based practice community correction departments or shops, they are individualizing case plans, which means that based on that risk assessment and that needs assessment that Brian mentioned, that they are identifying the domains that are driving the problems in the client's life, and in many cases, the criminal behavior in that client's life. And I'm sure you're aware, there's known as the Big Eight, and in one theory, the Big Four criminogenic risk factors that are known to drive problems in crime. And so individualized case planning simply is developing a case plan with the client that moves that client to address those criminogenic risk factors that they need to work on, and also to build protective factors in their life that would make them better. So, a system that supports evidence-based practices would guide an officer and a client through identifying what are those risk factors based on assessment, and what should we do together to actually work on them and improve your life. But a dynamic system would go a step beyond that, which would be to recommend the prioritization of goals and objectives, and beyond that, recommend to the officer what interventions they should use per domain. Does that make sense? So it's really the difference in a static system and a system that dynamically guides an officer to help a client. One area that really is emerging is a system to support evidence-based practices that listens and analyzes a client's journey. So this system that I'm describing knows where the client is supposed to be, knows what their requirements are, knows their case plan, and can listen and anticipate whether a client is showing up to services, is progressing, or not. And so the constant collection of automated data and then correlating that into insights is so needed in the addressing of the EBP gap. A system that does that is then able to surface actionable insights to the officer. Let me give you a couple of examples. The officer would have a dashboard. Data is being collected, analyzed, synthesized. The noise is being pushed down, as Brian articulated. And then those actionable insights are surfaced to the officer, so the officer knows ahead of that office visit what they should focus on with that particular client at that moment in time, given what the client has done or not done since the last time the officer has seen them. And so what might surface to the officer right before that office visit is the client in crisis or not? Are they stabilized in their medically assisted treatment? Have they had some indications of behavioral health or mental health issues that are not stabilized? So are they stabilized or are they not? Are they in crisis? Is the client's risk level improving or not? Does the client need a positive reinforcement, or what our field calls an incentive, for achieving a series of requirements, attending treatment sessions for the past week or the past 10 sessions, pain restitution, taking their, engaging their kids in a new way. So is positive reinforcement recommended and needed during this period of time, during this meeting? And then kind of the bigger questions or the bigger triggers. Does this client meet the threshold of an early termination from probation, from supervision? Oftentimes these are either not known or an officer has to manually kind of pull together a myriad of information and then try to figure it out. A smart system, a dynamic system, a system that crosses the gap and addresses the gap of evidence-based practices would dynamically surface these actionable insights to an officer. A simple example would be a client's office visit. So at a micro level, did the client show up? Yes or no? That's binary data. No, they didn't show up. So a system would surface that to the officer and then recommend a behavioral response. Now, a smart system, a modern system, would recommend the proper magnitude of response. It would recommend the type of behavioral response, and it would base that response in the risk and need of that client. So, an example, if a client is opioid dependent and they failed a drug test for opiates their second week on probation, a smart system that can comprehend the behavioral science would recommend a low-level sanction for that violation. Probably some homework on relapse prevention, maybe a clinical intervention, not what a human being might do who's not trained in behavioral research that might react to that positive drug test by putting them in jail for 7 days as a shock incarceration. Those two distinct responses have very different outcome potentials. And the first would actually lead a client to getting better. The second would lead the client to getting worse. And so here, for not attending, this would be probably a medium level response. And here are the recommendations based on risk need, assessment scores, agency policy. So a smart system would bring to bear policy to the officer, time on supervision, past behavior, and past responses, and smartly correlate that into a response to the officer. Then the officer would choose verbal admonishment, homework assignment, increase community service hours, increase contact, and then a smart system would document what the officer did and then be able to analyze going forward whether that extinguished the client's behavior or improved the client's behavior over time. A smart system would also enable the officer to deliver positive reinforcements or sanctions even through the client's smartphone so that it could be done swiftly and certainly as the science suggests improves outcomes. And then finally, because we have this very rich data set of what the client was supposed to do, did they do it? Did they get better? Did they get worse? What was the recommended response? What was the actual response over time, hundreds and hundreds of times over years of supervision, months and years of supervision? Then we can start answering the questions that Chief Richart articulated at levels that we frankly never been able to answer before. Here's just a random example at a supervisor level. If we're using a powerful analytics tool and a visualization tool like Tableau or Power BI applied to this data, we're seeing simply a supervisor who supervises 8 officers, and they can determine how quickly an officer gets a client under supervision, how swiftly responses are made, how many sanctions versus incentives versus clinical interventions an officer delivers, and then look at that across risk need of client profile, look at it across race, look at it across gender. There's literally 1,000 ways to slice and dice data. For the first time, we're able to see with a system like this what service providers are having good effects or not, with whom. We can look at what our policies, how our policies are being implemented officer by officer, unit by unit, and who they're effective with. So without the data and without a system that's tracking, thinking, analyzing, recommending, we can't get here. And we can't fill the research gap that exists about what works for whom when. So, Brian, do you want to speak at all to what a system like this might do in terms of answering the questions that haunt you?
There are a couple things that struck me as you were talking, Wes. The first is that with individual clients, there are so many variables that go into assisting them for the sake of their improvement that it's almost impossible for my officers to know whether or not they're making the right decision at the right time. And so having an automated analytics support system in the background, surfacing recommendations to them when they're having to see 8 people in a day, I think would be incredibly helpful. In medicine, they've got the entirety of history supporting every doctor in their clinical decisions that are being made, and yet still medicine it gets it wrong a number of times. And it almost frightens me to know the number of times that in a given day, my officers are not quite getting it right, and the outcome of that is so much potential destruction in the community among families and among the potential for hurt and harm and victimization if we don't get it right. It frightens me a little bit to think that my officers aren't able to gather all that information by no fault of their own. It simply is the set of circumstances
Right.
they have to deal with.
Right.
And so to have a system that actually could surface all of that into a single decision-making point and say, I've, as a computer, have considered 100 different factors to come to this decision. Follow it or don't follow it,
Yeah.
but this is what the science and all of the factors leading into this decision are causing me to recommend. And I think that, to me, it brings a lot of comfort as an administrator to know that at least they have the benefit of that robust technology behind them, that data, that science. So for me, that brings a lot of comfort as an administrator.
So to wrap up, thank you, Brian. Brian and I have both, from our professional experience, been working with a team to build such a system. The good news is this type of technology exists. Last but not least, it doesn't replace your case management system that you've spent a lot of money and time developing and managing. It's a bolt-on solution through API integration. At least that's the way we believe it should be done. So I know we're out of time. I've been given the time's up sign. So please do me a big favor and thank Brian for coming out and sharing his expertise with you. And we'll be up here to answer any questions for you.